Is BONELAB's combat bad? One of the main complaints I see people talking about with BONELAB is the combat, most notably the melee combat and the rather basic enemy AI that hasn't changed all that much since BONEWORKS. In this video, I'm going to discuss each form of combat, from melee with fists and weapons to the guns. Before we get into this though, I think it would make sense to touch on the enemies and their AI. At the bottom of the food chain, you have the null bodies. These are basically just mindless drones who will walk towards you and flail their arms when you alert them. They trip over everything, including their own feet, so I do enjoy just watching them sometimes. At the start of BONELAB, for example, this poor guy just wants to get down the escalator. This is a good example of their pathing just being funny bad. I don't think Stress Level 0 would have put this escalator section here if the null bodies were supposed to have better pathing. In BONEWORKS, they had their wireframes still visible on their character models, but they changed the design in BONELAB for some reason. You can see that the pathing and attack patterns are extremely basic. There is a lore reason for this, because they're supposed to just be worker AI in the virtual city of MythOS that have gone rogue. I don't mean that as an excuse, but the goofy AI never really bothered me in the context of the game they're in. Second, you have a variant of the null bodies that can throw projectiles. These were called Zombish in BONEWORKS and had different models, but now they are instead a blue null body in BONELAB. They have the same bad pathing as the regular null bodies, so it does lead to some pretty funny combat. The Crablet is basically a futuristic head crab from Half-Life. It's a sentient VR headset that has one basic attack: to pounce on your face and try to force you to watch furry Just kidding, but I always thought it was cool to see the inside of the headset as it forces you into some sort of simulation. These are also pretty tough to fight if there's a lot of them. The most advanced enemy in BONEWORKS and BONELAB are the Omni Projectors, which are basically hologram soldiers that roll around on these ball things. I say most advanced simply because they use guns. The rest of the enemy list take the form of either fixed or rolling turrets, as well as different forms of human NPCs that for some reason all want to fight you with their fists instead of weapons. They have far better AI than the null bodies due to them being living people, which leads me into the first form of combat I want to discuss: melee. To summarize a lot of the complaints about melee combat, people compare it to Blade and Sorcery a lot, which has the enemies actually wield weapons to fight you. They can swing swords and block your attacks, but let's be honest, melee combat in VR is goofy across the board. You're trying to fight imaginary enemies while holding imaginary weapons, so I can see why good melee combat is hard for a developer to implement in VR. This is by no means an excuse, but as good as a game you might find, the melee combat will have at least some jank to it. Even in Blade and Sorcery, the enemies can still be really dumb, and it's easy to learn their attack patterns. There are pros and cons to each game's form of melee combat, in my opinion. It would have been nice to see enemies that could wield the many weapons that are in BONELAB to fight you fair and square, but I still enjoyed the melee section, where you unlock the strong avatar. The human enemies do kind of just path towards you in a fighting stance, and it isn't hard to put them down even with fists, but the amount of variety in the melee weapons is a huge plus for me. I'm sure if somebody walked into my bedroom during this level when I was sampling various weapons and caving in skulls, I'd be in jail right now. BONELAB and BONEWORKS seem to have focused more on making the weapon physics feel right, rather than the AI be sharp enough to fight back properly, which I do agree is a shame. I still have no clue how they made a virtual sledgehammer feel heavy though, so we do need to give them some credit here. You can find crowbars, metal pipes, various knives and swords, hammers, shields, a medieval mace, and this isn't counting any of the stuff you can mod into the game. The variety of melee weapons here makes the combat fun, regardless of the enemy AI, to be honest. And I know this is not an excuse, and it's the second time I've mentioned lore, but in this level, you're playing a big muscly guy in a video game-esque world called Street Puncher, where bald men randomly pop out of garages to fight you. So I think some suspension of disbelief can be used here. There's also another level where you're this huge metal demon thing defending an obelisk. You can pick up the enemies and throw them due to your size, which was a really fun switch up in the physics. I think the context really does matter when complaining about the AI. I enjoy the weird vibe the Bone games give off, so none of it really bothered me, to be honest. My verdict on the melee combat: C+. Could do with improvement, but still very fun. Another complaint I've heard a lot, and kind of agree with, is regarding the gunplay. BONELAB added shotguns to the weapon roster that was previously just pistols, SMGs, assault rifles. The shotguns are hit and miss for me. For some reason, I noticed they were very janky. The recoil kinda seemed non-existent too, which was a surprise compared to the other guns. Also, the shells make a weird bubbly noise when they touch things. I'm not American, but this is now canonically the noise that shotgun shells make in my head. Prove me wrong. Personally, I really love the pistols. They sound and feel so crisp. The assault rifles feel pretty basic, and I don't know what it is, but the noise of the Mark 18 Saber Lake just sounds horrible. I had a lot of instances where my projectiles just wouldn't work, like bullets just going straight through enemies. Watch this part of the game near the end as an example. A bunch of enemies follow me out of the door, but my bullets are going straight through them. I've watched this clip multiple times to make sure it's not just me being retarded. The bullets are going through them. The SMGs do feel pretty nice. I really like the MP5K and the new addition, a Vector. To be honest though, I have more fun using dual pistols and melee weapons. My verdict on the gunplay, a pretty standard D. There are a lot of VR games with incredible gun physics. BONELAB isn't quite there, I'm afraid. The melee combat does seem to be the most complained about out of the two forms of combat, which I was really surprised about. I think the melee combat has a lot more promise to it than the gunplay. That damn assault rifle honestly made my ears bleed every time I used it. The work gone into the different melee weapons, making them all feel and behave differently, definitely deserves some credit here. It's my favourite part of BONELAB, and I understand wanting more from the combat in the game. Hopefully this is something that can be worked on in the future. There's always going to be more melee weapons modded into the game to play around with, which I'm definitely excited for. Either way, BONELAB is still a divisive topic 3 weeks after its release. What are your thoughts on the combat in the game? Personally, I would have liked to have some more challenge. The enemies do seem limited, and there's only a few parts of the game where you have a bunch attacking you at once instead of just one or two at a time. For someone who is used to playing VR games, this does kind of make the game feel like a cakewalk at times. My main complaint is that there wasn't really any challenge, so whether an improvement would take the form of better enemy AI or simply more levels and fights, I'm not quite sure. If you did enjoy, please consider liking and subscribing. I'd love to hear your own thoughts in the comments, so let me know if I've missed anything. If you're interested in VR content, I have a podcast with a friend called The Cockpit. We've got a Halloween-themed episode coming out at the end of the month, so check out the link in the description. Thanks for watching.